you, choir, and thank you, Foster. That was really beautiful. Well, for a bunch of fishermen, accustomed to being out on the water, presumably no matter what the weather is like, Jesus' disciples sure do get into a panic when it storms. The only calm one in all these storms at sea situation was the landlubber carpenter from Nazareth. Jesus lies asleep on a cushion, undisturbed by the wind and the waves, while the disciples get in a flap, rushing to and fro, trimming sails, bailing out the boat, imagining perhaps that their efforts could prove the equal or better of nature. Helpless and afraid, they turn to find Jesus sitting and sleeping in the stern, somehow insufficiently bothered by this storm to even be awakened by it. They wake him up, not for help or advice, but to lash out in frustration, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" With just a few words, Jesus, who had been happily dozing through the tossing waves and the howling winds, calms the storm with ease. And that was when the real terror of the night began. In the aftermath, in a sudden calm that must have seemed eerie after the violence of the storm, the disciples looked at Jesus, and we are told they were filled with a great awe. Now, that particular phrase from our Bibles this morning is actually a softer version of the original Greek language. Claiming that what the disciples felt was great awe is perhaps a little too courteous towards them. A less poetic translation says that they feared a great fear. That sounds more to me like a child hide under the bed during a thunderstorm kind of reaction, rather than the more restrained and mature great awe. Fearing a great fear sounds like sheer terror to me. And so the only time in the story when the disciples are described as terrified is not when the waves were tossing them around, the wind howling, the boat filling with water, but after Jesus rebukes both the waves and them. The terror comes not when they are shaking Jesus awake to ask if he cares if they live or die, but only when they are asking each other in the aftermath, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the seas obey him?" Now, are we surprised that the disciples were more frightened by Jesus than by the storm? After such an incredible display of power, I think it could have gone either way. They knew Jesus, they knew what he was like, even if they were still a little fuzzy about the Son of God thing. Maybe wonder might have been a response that we would expect, but we are not told that they asked their question with joy or admiration or anticipation. We are not told that they asked, "Who is this?" with excitement rising in their voices. No, they were afraid. Jesus' question cuts to the heart of the issue. Have you still no faith? Their response to this demonstration of Jesus' divine power suggests that the answer to that question is no, or at least not yet. Now, fear is something that each of us experiences at some point in our lives. And I'm not talking about sensible fears, like being afraid of burning your hand on the hot oven or being hit by a car if you walk into a busy street. Those are good fears. They will keep you alive and happy and healthy. I'm talking about the kind of fear that makes us feel trapped or paralyzed. Fear that causes us to lash out, sometimes at one another, sometimes even at God. We experience this kind of fear in our own lives as individuals, for our families or within our families, as congregations and churches, and also as concerned citizens of Canada and the world. We are afraid of the wind and waves that batter and rock our own fragile vessels, our happy lives, our comfortable churches, our safe countries. We fear disapproval, rejection, illness, pandemics, disability, financial insecurity, failure, and violence. We fear all of those things for ourselves and those we love. We also fear the death of our churches and of the cultural values and traditions that we've believed in for so long and in which we have invested ourselves. This kind of fear is pervasive. It slips in everywhere, into our society, our churches, our homes, and even into our hearts and minds. How do we respond to those fears? Do we confront them, or do we get lost, swamped and drowning in them? Now, in this story that we read today, fear is confronted, but not by a sudden burst of courage or resolve on the part of the disciples. They do not pull themselves together and take action despite their fears. They do not discover inner resources of strength that they didn't know they had, at least not on their own. The disciples did not rise to the challenge of the storm and best it through their own iron backbones and nerves of steel. It's Jesus who calms both them and the storm with the power of his presence. So for us today, the challenge in this gospel story is not to find some forgotten reserve of courage deep in ourselves for when our lives turn stormy. It's to not be too hard on ourselves when we do get scared. This story invites us to turn always and again to Jesus and remember that we are not alone in the boat, that the one who we trust to be more powerful than all the storms in our lives is right there alongside us. Now, if the landlubber in the boat was anyone but Jesus, it could be argued that he didn't understand the danger that he and the disciples were in, as well as those more experienced fishermen did. That storm on the Sea of Galilee was likely quite frightening. Galilee is a very shallow lake, and it's several hundred feet below sea level, so the wind would drive down over the hills and churn up the lake. For those of you who boat, you know that a shallow lake quickly becomes very treacherous in a high wind. But it was Jesus in the boat, so he knew exactly how much danger they were in from the sea. And this is important. What I'm going to say next is really, really important. Jesus didn't say to them, "There's nothing to be afraid of." He didn't suggest for a moment that the disciples were wrong in their estimation of the danger of the storm. He didn't say, "There's nothing to be afraid of." Rather, he asked, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" During a noisy, windy thunderstorm or a blinding snow squall, we might tell our children and our dogs and our cats and even ourselves that there's nothing to be afraid of. And most of the time these days, for us, actual storms, that's pretty true. There really isn't much to be afraid of. But the power can go out. A tree can get blown over onto the roof. Floodwaters can rise. Whiteout conditions can emerge. Tornadoes can form seemingly out of nothing. However remote, it's never, strictly speaking, true to say that there's nothing to be afraid of. There's a big difference between "there's nothing to fear" and "do not be afraid." And it's "do not be afraid" that Jesus is asking his disciples about. The whole question, the whole moment, though, seems to backfire on Jesus. Instead of encouraging his disciples to relax, to be calm and be at peace, Jesus has caused them to fear a great fear. And why is that, do you think? Faith in God with us, Jesus being in the boat with us, that gives you and I hope, doesn't it? That even in the darkest and most fearful moments of our lives, Jesus is there. And the disciples had been around Jesus long enough to know that he had extraordinary gifts and powers to heal, to cast out demons, that he was a uniquely wise and compelling teacher. When disabled people stood up and walked, when people with leprosy and other horrible diseases were healed and demons fled before him, the disciples were not afraid. But this powerful display of authority over creation itself was too much for them. And that's because it made it clear that Jesus was more than just a healer or a teacher, that he was, in fact, somehow God himself. And it's one thing to be a follower of someone great, to have hitched your wagon to a charismatic healer or a teacher. But things are different when you realize that you're in the presence not of a gifted person, but of God. and the disciples were terribly afraid. The bit we read from the book of Job gives us a sense of why they were so afraid. Our God is a God of unmeasurable, vast power over all creation, and he can get pretty fierce in telling us about his boundless power. The take-home message of Job's experiences with God is that God is God and we are not. And sometimes that's a really, really good and amazing gift. And sometimes it's an overwhelming and frightening truth. The disciples discovered that the man dozing in the boat beside them has this same vast, unmeasurable, boundless command and power over creation. And they were afraid. But even more awe-inspiring and overwhelming is the faith that we have that God's love for us, that Jesus' love for us, is also vast, unmeasured, and boundless, and given freely. The novel Pilgrim's Progress, it's very, very old. You may not have read it. But if you've heard of it, you will know that it talks of a story of a dream pilgrimage, of the trials and adventures of a good man named Christian. It's not a subtle book. Christian flees his home, called the City of Destruction, and he's heading towards the celestial city called Heaven. It's a very rich story that sort of conveys this journey of faith. Christian travels through danger and distractions like the Slough of Despond, Vanity Fair, and Doubting Castle. His companions on the way are named things like Faithful, Hopeful, and Obstinate. Now, the bit that I want to tell you about is something that happens right near the end of cross a large and fearsome river, and he is horribly afraid. Together with his companion Hopeful, they wade into the waters of this river, and Christian cries out, "I sink in deep waters, the billows go over my head, all his waves go over me." Hopeful responds with the kind of hope that only faith can bring. Hopeful says, "Be of good cheer, my brother. I feel the bottom, and it is good." The hard truth is that there are things in this world to be afraid of, and they are very real. Accidents, illness, losing one's job, money problems, failure, broken relationships, rejection, loneliness, isolation, and pain. I could go on. These are unavoidable realities, part of the broken world we live in. But as we grow in faith, we come to understand that even though such fear-worthy things are real, they do not have the last word. They do not have ultimate power over us, because reigning over this world of fearsome things is God. God, who is so much mightier, whose strength and justice and holiness far outweigh any hard or painful thing. A God from whose love we cannot be separated, not by anything in creation. We do not need to be afraid. Not because there's nothing to be afraid of. Not because there are no storms, no fierce winds, or no waves. We do not need to be afraid because Jesus is with us, and we are not alone in our boats. Amen.